Welcome to the second annual Global Sleep Symposium. We're so happy to have you here. Hopefully you all got a chance to interact with some of our amazing partner brands in the other room, and if not, there will certainly be another opportunity to throughout the evening. We're really excited for the next couple of hours, which will really take a deep dive into all things sleep, from technology and innovation to why we need to sleep. To begin the evening, we're going to have a Chronotype session led by renowned Dr. Matt Walker, the best-selling author of Why We Sleep and neuroscientist at UC Berkeley. From there, we will have a panel discussion at 6 p.m. with a short break in between, so plenty of time to mingle with our experts and some of our brands. So Dr. Walker, I will kick it off.
Thank you so much. So firstly, thanks for coming along to spend precious time. Who here, hands up, has heard of the term chronotype? Okay, 44 minutes left then. What else could we just, well, I was born in Liverpool in chronotype is interesting because I think it's one of the things that is misunderstood for so many reasons. Your chronotype is simply, are you a morning type, evening type, or somewhere in between? And in sleep science, we can break it down. Sometimes we do a 5 split where it's extreme morning type, neutral, evening type, extreme evening type. But for the most part, let's just call it a 3 split. And it's about a quarter, 50%, a quarter, or a third, depending on whose data you believe, a split across society. If you are a night owl, it's not your fault. And I'm not trying to lead a sort of a movement in self-compassion, even though I would get behind that. What I mean is that it's largely, though not exclusively, but largely genetically determined. There are currently over 350 genes that dictate your morningness or your eveningness. I say just over. If you want to know the real number, it's 351. I did say just over. And so it is gifted to you at birth, and it will persist throughout your lifetime. A couple of interesting stats. On average, men are 30 minutes more evening type than females until about the age of 50. And then there's parity between the sexes. Another interesting fact is that there is a deficiency in your sleep if, as a night owl, you're trying to sleep like a morning type. And based on the data, taking a night owl and putting them to a morning type schedule, in the first 2 hours of sleep, you will have 50% less deep electrical brainwave activity or deep sleep activity than your morning type counterpart. Why? Because your morning type counterpart is being given the ability to sleep in harmony with their chronotype rather than against it. And that's the thing. You will often hear people who will say, I've got terrible sleep onset insomnia, where I'm in bed for the first 2 hours and I'm wide awake and I don't know why. And some people do have sleep onset insomnia. But if you do a chronotype test, which hopefully you've all done a little bit of a version of using the QR code, what you find out is that this person is an evening type, and their sweet spot would be about 12:30 a.m. But society, in the way their life is programmed, has them going to bed at 10:30 p.m. They don't have sleep onset insomnia. They have a mismatch between their natural chronotype and when society is forcing them to sleep on the 24-hour clock face. So that's another one of the reasons why chronotype is so important. I suspect many of you have heard of the circadian rhythm, correct? I suspect many of you may scratch your heads and think, what's the difference between a circadian rhythm and a chronotype? And it's a little odd, but let me see if I can go with you. A circadian rhythm is this beautiful, almost sinusoidal rhythm. And we as a diurnal species, we're awake during the day, and then our rhythm drops down and hits a nadir in the middle of the night, and then rises back up again. All of you here have a 24-hour circadian rhythm. That's not different. We all have a very similar sinusoidal wave of a circadian rhythm. But I've just told you there is vast variability in your chronotype. And your chronotype is when you want to be awake and when you want to be asleep. Isn't that circadian rhythm? Not quite. Your circadian rhythm goes up and down. We all go up and down. But where your preference is for that sinusoidal wave to be placed on the 24-hour clock face is your chronotype. So yes, my rhythm is just like your rhythm, but my rhythm as maybe a neutral is 1.5 hours ahead of your rhythm as a morning type, or an hour behind your rhythm as a night owl. Does that make some sense in terms of, I know it's a wacky way of thinking about it. The other reason it's important for you to sleep in harmony with your chronotype is because there are consequences beyond disrupted sleep, such as masquerading as sleep onset insomnia and the deficiency in deep sleep. For example, we know chronotypes who are evening types, sleeping as morning types, will have a 30% higher risk of cardiovascular disease. 30%. They have a 60% increased risk of being diabetic, of having type 2 diabetes. They have a 200% increased risk of suffering from depression or using antidepressants. They have a 102% higher consumption rate of caffeine. Now you may think, does that mean that if you are a genetic evening type, you're just more sickly? And we don't honestly know the answer to that, but it's more than likely no. That it's just that society currently is biased towards the morning types. And we have this notion that sort of the type A personality should be rewarded. And you've had the notion that the early bird catches the worm. P.S. the second mouse gets the cheese. Nevertheless, what I would say is it's a funny way that we stigmatize the night owls, and we shouldn't. Again, it's like saying, well, we're going to reward people with brown eyes. Yeah. Well, and I'm going to be stigmatized. I've got blue eyes. I'm so sorry. It wasn't my fault. I didn't get to choose it. It was genetic. But we lambast evening types as being slothful or lazy. But again, it's not their fault. And so we don't look at morning types and say, gosh, you're so lazy. Why do you go to bed so early? But we look at night owls and we say, you wake up so late, you're lazy. I don't understand the difference between the two. And I think the consequences that I just described are in part because night owls are so deficient in their sleep. They struggle to sleep, they don't get the best quality of sleep, and they're forced to wake up earlier than they would otherwise. And you say, well, where's the data for that? There's a really interesting study where they looked at morning types and evening types, and they also looked at neutral types. If you look at neutral types and morning types, how much sleep are they getting during the week? On average, they were getting about 7.2 hours of sleep during the week. When they looked at the night owls, they were only getting 6.6 hours of sleep a night. And then you could say, well, okay, could it not be the parsimonious alternative explanation that night owls aren't getting deficient sleep because society is forcing them to sleep at the incorrect time? It's just that they have a lower sleep need. And that's why they're getting 6.6 hours of sleep. They're doing fine, presumably. Not so. I used a word, during the week, because then they looked at the weekend. The neutrals and the morning types, they went from 7.2 hours during the week to 7.5 hours during the weekend. The night owls, who were at 6.6 hours during the week, what did they do? If their natural sleep need was just 6.6 hours, they should sleep the same amount. They rocketed up to 8.9 hours at the weekend. 6.6 hours is not their natural sleep need. You calculate the difference between that at the end of the month, you're carrying a 15-hour sleep debt every month, month after month. Have I frightened you enough? But I do think that we need to try to abandon this notion of trying to lambast the night owls as being deficient and embrace their natural biology. Now, you could then also ask, I am a night owl, and you're talking about this thing called the ideal world. But drum roll, Matt, none of us live in the ideal world. We live in the real world. Can you not just come down to my level at least? So there was a great study out of Australia where they tried to change night owls to morning types. And the question was, can you kind of get a leopard to change its chronotype spots? The answer was kind of, maybe-ish. What they ended up doing is having these 11 incredibly strict rules that you had to comply to. And these were night owls that were sort of, 12:30 a.m., 1 a.m. And it started out, I'll miss all of them, but it was wake up 2 hours earlier than you would normally otherwise, eat breakfast straight away, get 30 minutes of daylight within the first 2 hours, eat lunch 2 hours earlier. When you go out in the afternoon, try to wear shades, don't nap after 3 p.m., cut yourself off from caffeine after 2 p.m., eat 3 hours before bed, go to bed 2 hours before you would otherwise, each and every day and each and every night. And they were successful. They dragged them back by about 90 minutes, 9-0. But if you're an evening type that is wanting to go to bed at 1 a.m., you're still not a morning type who's getting into bed at 9:30 p.m. You've only dragged yourself back by 90 minutes. Plus, I don't know how realistic a way of life that is. You can create fancy technologies and behavioral programs, but if the adherence rate after a month is almost zero, no matter how fancy and effective it is, it's not long-term sustainable. And so, can we not, if we're doing that, like if we are pretzel contorting ourselves in all of these 11 different rules for this, that, and the other, can we not just say, give in to biology? Because when you fight biology, you normally lose. And the way you know you've lost is disease and sickness. And that's exactly what we see in some of the studies with chronotypes and evening types. So I'm so sorry if you're a morning type, because I felt like I've been barking orders and dismay at you. I promise I haven't. And for the record, I'm desperately vanilla and pedestrian, and I'm just a neutral. So neither one. I don't have a horse in the race. So I'll stop there because most of the time people don't respond to monologues; they respond to dialogues. And I'd love to have a dialogue with you. I'd love to hear about your questions about chronotype. But honestly, if you're sick and tired of chronotype, let's open it up. It's free for all for sleep. What would you like to know?
So the Australian study, was there adherence? Was there any adherence to that?
Yeah, so for the Australian study, there was adherence for the experimental time period.
And then after that?
They didn't follow up, not that I know
They didn't
of.
follow up. Okay, that tells us.
So and my suspicion is, I would love to know the data. I think some people for whom it really was, life necessary, they would have complied because of necessity rather than preference. And behavioral change is so hard without massive amounts of motivation, and usually it's a stick rather than a carrot that gets people there.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
What would you recommend for couples to have completely different chronotypes?
Come on. Thankfully, I don't have to answer the question because I'm not the expert in the room on this one. This is Dr. Wendy Troxel.
Hello, thank you, Matt. I will be part of the presentation later, but yes, given that I've written a book on couples and sleep, I can speak to the fact that you are not the only one who may be in a mismatched pair, though statistically speaking, it is true that, larks do tend to pair with larks and owls with owls. In part that, might be some sort of selective mating. It's also true that if you're an owl and you're out at a bar and you meet your future partner at 2 a.m., you are unlikely to run into a morning lark. But there are the exceptions where larks and owls do pair, and you're not doomed. There are some studies, mostly cross-sectional, that have shown that there are some issues with mismatched pairs, that they tend to have higher levels of conflict, lower levels of relationship satisfaction, less sex. The list does go on, but again, I said you're not doomed. Those same studies showed that the sort of impairments in relationship quality that we see in mismatched pairs are only true when the couples also have low problem-solving skills. So the answer is whether it's issues that you have to navigate during the daytime or at night if you have good problem solving skills with your partner. For instance, if you all can find that sacred time before either one of you goes to bed to share some quality time together. And then if your partner's the morning lark who goes to bed earlier than you, they go off to bed after you've had some sacred quality time as a couple. They go to bed, you come to bed at your later, more natural bedtime. Instead of doing the thing that many couples do, which is, like Matt said earlier, you try to go to bed, not just because the clock time says it is, but because your partner who's ready for bed is, the lark is going to bed, and then you lie there in bed, awake and frustrated and resentful. So instead, preserve some time before going to bed, then go to bed at your natural bedtime.
I'm so glad I gave Wendy the mic because I was just about to say, FUBAR. But no, that was a much better hopeful answer. Yes.
First of all, I feel seen as a night owl. Where do you think the notion that you're superior if you get up really early and need less sleep originates? And is it distinctly American?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think there is some degree of the rise and grind culture mentality that's still there. I think when you marry that with the stigma that is associated with sleep per se, and this notion that now, maybe a little bit less so of recent times, but this notion of competitive undersleeping in certain facets. It's almost this sleep machismo attitude of braggadocio that, how little can you get away with? So I think some of that has just come from the early morning risers means that you need probably less sleep. And when you think about it, if someone comes up to you and says, gosh, I'm someone who actually needs about 8.5 hours of sleep, often people will say, really? And there's a very interesting sentiment in the way that they say, really? Which is that, what are you doing with your time? Do you have that much time? And then follow that logic through. It means that if you have that much time to sleep, you must not be busy. And we equate busyness with importance. And in society, everybody wants to seem important. And so I think one of the status symbols has obviously been importance, which if you trail it back and reverse engineer it, means that you are probably awake a lot longer than other people because I'm so busy, because I'm so important. So I think the roots of some of that come with the sort of a modernity inculcation. I think the other aspect, however, comes from just the agrarian nature that came before the Industrial Revolution, which was that we had to be awake early because the Edison Light Company had not yet electrified the night. We didn't control when it was day and night. The sun did. And when that was the case, we had to be awake early. But the difference there, I suspect if you look at the data, was that people didn't have Netflix or TikTok or doom scrolling. So they woke up early, but they were also going to bed early. Doesn't mean that there weren't still chronotypes in that era. There have always been chronotypes. It's just that now we're burning the candle at both ends. And in this modern world, the one thing that gets squeezed like vice grips in the middle of the night is this thing called an adequate sleep.
Does everybody need the same amount of sleep, 7 to 8 hours, or do some people need less sleep? I've read both sides of that, and I don't know.
Yeah, everyone needs 8.123 hours of sleep.
I thought so.
I can see it in your eyes. No, there is a wonderful amount of variability in biological sleep need. And I say that both intra and inter-individual, which is just a fancy way of saying, firstly, across from one individual to the next, which is your question, there is variability. Somewhere between 7 to 9 hours seems to be the sort of the bell curve majority of that distribution. Are there people at the tail ends of that distribution? Yes, there are absolutely some people who can survive on less than 7 hours of sleep and do that in a healthy manner. on that far extreme of the tail end of the distribution to the left, in terms of short sleep, we now know that there are a collection of individuals that we call the genetic short sleepers. There are at least 3 genes that have been identified now that will dictate a shorter sleep need or a shorter sleep necessity in you. And some of the studies, they've shown that you can get away with as little as 6 hours. I think one study was about 6 hours and 11 minutes was their natural innate sleep need when left to, you've got all of the time in bed that you would like. Some studies showing that they can survive on maybe 4.5 hours of sleep if you restrict them to that and not show impairment, whereas most of the rest of us who don't have that remarkable genetic Teflon coat of armor against sleep loss will implode very quickly on that little sleep. It does typically lead then to a room of people thinking, or many of them thinking, I'm one of those people. Statistically, the chances are unlikely. I think one of the statistics for one of the genes would suggest that you are more likely to get struck by lightning in your lifetime than you are to be a genetic short sleeper. I want to though speak to the intra component of that too, because don't forget, our sleep need is not stable. It changes across the lifespan. So when we were infants, we were sleeping maybe 16 hours out of the 24, and then it scales down dramatically. And then it hits this stability point in our sort of late 20s, and then it stays stable, but then begins, unfortunately, the great sleep decline as we get into our later years, the 6th and 7th decades of life. And there you can then ask the question, well, older adults sleep less. And there's a myth out there that says, therefore, older adults need less sleep. And if you look at the data, it's not really true. That would be the equivalent of me saying, older adults, as they get older, have weaker bones. Because as we age, we just need less strong bones.
Yeah.
We don't say that. We supplement you with calcium and we give you resistance training. And I know, because I'm now solidly in the foothills of middle age, past it. And so I don't know why we take a different mentality with sleep. But to your point, and it's a very elegant question, there is both variability across individuals and also within an individual across the lifespan.
Thank you.
So in the Australian study or elsewhere, do you see people who are night owls that do shift their sleep times to earlier? Is the quality of, initially I'm sure there'll be a insomnia because you can't fall asleep, but like longer term, after that, do you see a difference in the sleep quality that they get when they shift?
Yes, you do, and it typically, there is some degree of acclimation, and you can ask why. In part, it's because people come up with additional strategies to help themselves, to try to make things more night owl-like, even though they're getting to bed in a more morning lark fashion. But once you get to that, then the sleep does not seem to be, necessarily corrected. You don't seem to quote unquote get used to it. A good example of this is if you were to invert the question entirely, which is shift work, where all of a sudden you don't just try to be, 2 or 3 hours mismatched. You're now 8 or 10 or even 12 hours mismatched. So let's take it all the way to the extreme and see how far, in those extreme circumstances, is there any adaptation? And unfortunately, if you look at the rates of diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, rates of infection, rates of cancer, all of those are markedly higher in individuals with shift work. Dementia as well. Fascinating study where they were looking at sort of this type of split shift pattern. And it's more so jet lag in truth, but they were looking at long haul pilots and also long haul flight crew. And what they found is that sort of circadian disruption, trying to sleep when you should be awake and trying to be awake when you should be asleep, it caused brain atrophy, which is again a fancy way of saying your brain shrinks, particularly in the memory centers of the brain. And the atrophy was quite considerable. You could then say, well, maybe it's the fact that people who have a smaller memory center to begin with just end up going into the airline industry because you didn't have a baseline measure before, which is actually a scientifically valid thing, except that if you look at the number of years that people have been on the job, the size of the atrophy, the extent of the brain degradation scales in a linear fashion, which again is not causation, it's correlation, but it's getting you closer to mechanism. So all of which is to say, I don't see, and in some ways it's not surprising to me because, if you look at even some of the earliest evolutionary species like earthworms who've been around for millennia, they have a circadian rhythm. Even bacteria, as long as they live for multiple days in a row, even they have some circadian rhythmicity to their biology. What I mean by that is circadian rhythms emerged with life itself on this planet, and they have fought their way through heroically every step along the evolutionary path, including in us, Homo sapiens. So imagine something that took 3.6 million years to put in place, and then I come along and I think, well, okay, I can kind of tough it up, I can do the job for the next 15 years, and I'm sure I can overcome it. Usually that's misguided at the least, and if an industry is trying to force that on you, then it's hubristic at best.
So I'd like to know a little bit your opinion on napping. So for instance, if you regularly only sleep 5 or 6 hours, but then midday you have the ability to sleep and you go and you get another 2, is that quality of sleep sort of adding up and getting you to that 8 hours, or is it not the same?
It's complicated. So if you can nap and nap consistently, then within that 24-hour window, as long as it's for the most part just one kind of solid nap, and the quality of that nap, plus there's nothing wrong with the quality of your sleep that you're getting, even though it's 6.5 hours at night, is also good, then usually it's green light, thumbs up, go for it. Because in some ways there's an argument about how we were designed to sleep, and we were just speaking about this just in a session before this. There is a notion that we as a species should not be sleeping how we do in the modern world, which is monophasically, one long bout of sleep at night. Because if you look at sort of, Mediterranean cultures, Latin American cultures, they have a siesta-like activity, which is biphasic sleep, 6 hours-ish at night, maybe 40, 45 minutes, an hour during the day. If you look at hunter-gatherer tribes, the data there is a bit more mixed. In the winter, in the colder months, they typically don't nap. Whereas in the hot summer months, they typically will have a siesta-like nap. But it's usually not, something of a 2-hour duration. It's usually 15, 20, 30 minutes. So I would say that if you have good quality of sleep at night, and you're not trying to use naps necessarily to overcome poor quality of sleep the night before, you're just using naps to add to the shorter quantity of sleep that you got the night before, then I think you're okay. And because the data is, and the reason I say it's complicated, the data is very mixed. There are some studies that say napping can be protective. There was a recent study literally just came out, I think like a week or 2 weeks ago, showing that napping was quite use your words, Matthew. Vernacular, please, declarative sentences, simple, short. They were suggesting that it was dementia protective. However, there are also some studies that show that older adults who start napping during the day have a high risk of converting to Alzheimer's disease in the years later. The reason being is that the quality of the sleep that they were having the night before was so poor, it was so fragmented, it was so discontinuous that they had so much sleep pressure built up the next day because they hadn't jettisoned it the night before because of the poor quality. They were forced to nap because they just couldn't stay awake. Now the nap becomes a proxy for bad sleep the night before, and now the nap becomes a proxy for ill health outcomes versus healthy napping. And that's why I would say you really need to know what the quality of the sleep is the night before in order to determine whether the nap that's being used is beneficial or maladaptive. Does that make some sense? Okay. Yes.
Is sleep debt real, and how long does it take to make up for a really bad night of sleep?
Oh, it's absolute BS. I wouldn't believe anyone who talks. No, it is a real thing. A sleep debt, you can measure it within the biological system. You can short sleep an individual, and you can estimate how deficient their sleep is. And based on that deficiency of growing debt, we can estimate how hard are they going to rebound on a recovery night of sleep. And there's classic studies from people like David Dinges who demonstrated what's called a dose-response relationship. The greater and greater the debt that I build up across 4 nights or 5 nights or 6 nights, the harder you sleep on the recovery nights. We use recovery rebound sleep as a metric of how much sleep debt was in the system. If there was no evidence of if sleep debt did not exist, there should be no dose-response relationship in terms of the hardness of the rebound that comes after. And so, yes, the notion of a sleep debt is real. Probably another myth that's buried in there is that you can repay the debt easily and completely. You can repay the debt. I just told you, you rebound harder if you've got a greater debt. That's not, there's a separate question there, which is, do I recover fully and pay off my debt? So if I take you and I deprive you tonight of sleep for an entire night, and then I give you all of the recovery sleep that you want on the next night, and even the next night, do you sleep longer the next night and the next night? Yes, you absolutely do. But you only make back about 50 to 60% of the sleep that you lost. You never make it back up in its entirety. That's one of the nefarious aspects of an accruing sleep debt. And you could ask the question then, well, why? Why is biology not doing its job and getting, even when you give it the chance, it doesn't get it back? Why is the system failing? Because there's precedent for this, another system. It's called the fat cell. And during our evolutionary past, we had feast and we had famine. And biology understood that when it faced famine, it was going to go into a debt. So next time when feast came around, you would store that energy as caloric credit, called the fat cell, the adipose cell, so that you could spend that caloric credit when you went into the debt. Where is the fat cell for sleep? I would like it. And the reason it doesn't exist in part is because Mother Nature has never had to face the challenge, because human beings seem to be the only species that will deliberately deprive themselves of sleep for no apparent evolutionary benefit. It's not to say that there isn't sleep deprivation in biology, there is. When you're caring for your young or you're undergoing conditions of starvation, you will forego sleep for greater amounts of wakefulness. In the former, to protect your young. In the latter, to forage for food in a broader perimeter, because clearly it's not working out for you in your current circumstance. Absent that, which is break glass in case of emergency, rather than Netflix or TikTok doom scrolling, we've never faced that challenge. So Mother Nature has never had to come up with a system of a fat cell for sleep, a storage system for sleep. That's why we can't seem to recover as much sleep as we've lost in total.
Could you talk about doom scrolling and sleep, whether you do it in the morning, night, constantly, or?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm probably, it's not a field that we study in particular. People like Michael Gredazar in Australia have done some brilliant work in this area. We used to think firstly that the blue light from these devices was the kind of the death nail of all things sleep if you use it at night, to your question on the circadian clock face. There's a very famous study that came out of Harvard, and it was a great study, and it showed that melatonin production was impaired, it was delayed, and it disrupted your REM sleep. But then subsequent studies started to find it hard to replicate that effect. What they found is that these devices with screens absolutely disrupt your sleep, but it doesn't seem to be the blue light especially. What it does is it is designed to capture your attention economy. And people have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to ruthlessly fleece you of your attention credit. And it's the attention activation of your cortex that leads to the sleep problems. It's not that these devices necessarily, the blue light is so sleep kind of deleterious. It's that you are perfectly sleepy, and if an electromagnetic bulb burst through the room and all the lights on your phone went out, within about 5 minutes you'd think, gosh, I'm pretty sleepy. It's just that the devices, through their activation, had hit the mute button on your sleepiness, and fooled you into thinking you were much more wide awake than you actually were at a biological level.
So if that's the case, you would have trouble falling asleep if you were doing it, not getting up in the middle of the night.
Well, it's both, because one of the frightening pieces of data in teenagers is FOMO, that teenagers now are reportedly saying that they will, sometimes they will program themselves to wake up through alarms throughout the night because they don't want to have missed out on what's been going on throughout the night with their social peers. So it's now creating this fragmentation of sleep at a time when the brain is so thirsty for it because it's going through accelerated development.
But if you don't have that FOMO, you would feel it going to sleep, not waking up.
Correct. So if there was a great study where they essentially removed you from most of modernity, it was a Kenneth Wright study, and he took people hiking in the Sierra Rockies. And all of a sudden, now people are saying, I naturally like to go to bed at midnight, were actually falling asleep around about 10:30 or 11. They were sleeping longer if it was in the winter. They were sleeping a little bit shorter if it was in the summer. That was mostly because of the daylight. They all of a sudden started to revert back to a much more natural sleep tendency, and the number of awakenings throughout the night decreased dramatically as a consequence. In fact, looking at the hunter-gatherer tribes is another good example of how technology and maybe doom scrolling has interfered. In one of the studies where they were asking these tribes an insomnia severity questionnaire, and we have one, and they really struggled to understand the question. What do you mean, do I have problems falling asleep or staying asleep? Well, we just sleep. Don't you sleep? And the answer, Christ, we can't get it even if we try. So there is something about the modern world, and I think technology. There is something that I would also mention in that regard. Yes, doom scrolling is not beneficial because it hits. The reason that you can't stop is because you are on an emotional sort of hedonic treadmill, that it's very dopamine sensitive. And you either like to look at things that are bad or negative, because it turns out there is some dopamine reward in that negativity. Dopamine is not just a pleasurable neurochemical. And what that means is that you ramp up the emotional centers of the brain. To fall asleep, those same emotional centers need to do the opposite. They need to ramp down. That's why we have what's called the tired but wired syndrome in society, that I'm so tired, I'm so desperately tired, but I'm so emotionally wired that I can't fall asleep. One of the reasons is in part your phone. The other is just major stress throughout society.
On that note, we're going to take a short break.